In the previous video, we looked at the effects of blood pressure and osmotic pressure and how they drive the movement of water out of and then back into circulatory capillaries, thereby driving the movement of nutrients out of blood into the surrounding cells that can then use those nutrients for growth and as an energy source, as well as driving the movement of cellular waste out of these surrounding cells and into capillaries so that the circulatory system can then carry those nutrients away. What we want to account for in this video is the overall movement of water and how, despite how capillaries appear to undergo a water loss, there is actually a rather intricate system of water recovery that occurs after the fact. Now, if we do a quick recap here, we remember that at the artery end of a capillary, because the artery end is always closer to the beating part of the heart as opposed to the vein end, blood pressure is going to be significantly greater than osmotic pressure, which drives the movement of water out of the capillaries, thereby carrying dissolved nutrients out of the blood towards the cells that require those nutrients. Nothing new there. Now, through experimental measurement, we can actually see that blood pressure is greater than osmotic pressure by 9 units. The unit doesn't really matter here, but we can see that the difference is actually measurable here. Now, if we do the same thing, if we quantify the difference between osmotic pressure and blood pressure at the venous end or at the venual end, we can see that osmotic pressure is greater than blood pressure by 6 units here. Now, the problem with this is because the blood pressure is greater than osmotic pressure by a greater degree than the opposite at the venual end, what this means is that more water is actually forced out at the artery end of our capillaries than water is actually recovered at the vein end of the capillary. So because of this difference here, because blood pressure has a greater effect of forcing water out than osmotic pressure has of allowing the vein end to recover water, what this means is that each capillary is going to experience a slight water loss as a result of the nutrient and waste transfer that occurs when blood passes through a capillary network. Now, does this mean that your blood is constantly losing water? Well, yes and no. Yes, on the one hand, because blood pressure is greater than osmotic pressure at this end, more water is forced out than is recovered. But as we can see, if we look at an actual capillary network, we can see that just looking at capillaries is not telling the whole story. Now, because blood pressure is greater than osmotic pressure to a greater degree at the arterial end, again, more water is going to be forced out of the artery end of a capillary network than water is able to be recovered at the venual end, and therefore capillaries cannot actually reabsorb 100% of the water that was originally forced out. However, if we take a look at this capillary network, we can also see that lymphatic capillaries are intertwined among them, and any water that isn't recovered at the venual end of capillaries can actually be recovered by lymphatic capillaries because, again, they are intertwining around the circulatory capillary network. Now, eventually, this water that gets reabsorbed into lymphatic capillaries can then be transported out of the lymphatic capillaries, and eventually it is going to make its way to one of the centers of the lymphatic system, that being your lymph nodes. Now, within lymph nodes, we can see that because lymph nodes contain white blood cells that are inactive, lymph nodes require a constant supply of blood in order to supply all of the cells within the lymph node, including white blood cells, with a constant supply of oxygen and nutrients, and therefore when the lymphatic vessels actually carry all of the water that they have reabsorbed from this capillary network here, that water can then actually re-enter the circulatory system via the capillary network that is found inside the lymph nodes. So regardless of whether your circulatory system actually loses more water than it releases, at least in capillary networks, because the lymphatic system works closely with the circulatory system, the lymphatic system can recover the extra water that was not reabsorbed by the circulatory system, and by the time it makes it to a lymph node, that water can then be transferred back into the blood, allowing a more or less complete water recovery regardless of the difference in blood pressure and osmotic pressure. This concludes our series not just on capillaries, but on the circulatory system as a whole. So to test your knowledge of the functioning and mechanisms of capillaries, you can take a look at this case study here that actually looks at the process behind how capillary networks are actually grown, and see if you can answer the practice questions related to the process of capillary development, and then try the practice problems below to test your knowledge of how capillaries actually work within the context of the greater circulatory system.